Chefs Without Restaurants, episode 89 with Sarah and Isaiah from Keepwell Vinegar and White Rose Miso.
Growing and scaling as business principles of their own are really tough for us because, a lot of what we do is based on working really closely with the sources that we have. And, there's just a certain point where you've got to stop tailoring your process and your business to what's out there and what the greatest crop is and what tastes the best. And you have to start, meeting contracted needs, or you have to pack things in a pallet a certain way, or you have to make things fit a system. And you have to go back and start talking to your growers and asking them to change what they do to fit your model. And that, when we feel like we need to do that, that's the point where we decide that the business is as big as it's ever going to be.
This is the Chefs Without Restaurants podcast with your host, Chris Spear. Each week, I'll be speaking with food entrepreneurs and people in the culinary industry. If you're interested in learning more about our organization dedicated to helping people build and grow their food businesses, look us up on the web at chefswithoutrestaurants.com and .org, and on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Chefs Without Restaurants. Now, enjoy the show. Welcome to the Chefs Without Restaurants podcast. I'm your host, Chris Spear. On the show, I have conversations with culinary entrepreneurs and people in the food and beverage industry who took a different route. They're caterers, research chefs, personal chefs, cookbook authors, food truckers, farmers, cottage bakers, and all sorts of culinary renegades. I myself fall into the personal chef category as I started my own personal chef business, Perfect Little Bites, 10 years ago. And while I started working in kitchens in the early 90s, I've literally never worked in a restaurant. On this week's episode, we have Sarah and Isaiah, who are the founders of Keepwell Vinegar and White Rose Miso, companies that use fermentation to support the entire picture of local agriculture: fruits, vegetables, grains, seasonal summer gluts, and lean winter storage crops. Former pastry chefs, they wanted pantry items that were as local and sustainable as the fresh ingredients they worked with every day. Today, Keepwell Vinegar and White Rose Miso produce dozens of acid and koji-driven fermentations for chefs and bartenders alike, with or without restaurants. We talk about their culinary background, which includes working at Baltimore's Woodberry kitchen, and how they started making vinegar and fermented products. We discuss some innovative ways to use their items and how to best store them. Can miso expire? We discuss that. They also share who some chefs using their products are, and we get into the true cost of food. You'll also learn about vinegar pie and sorghum molasses. I hope you enjoy this episode, and if you want to see all the products that Sarah and Isaiah have for sale, check out their website, keepwellvinegar.com. And if you'd like to support our show financially, you can go to patreon.com/Chefs Without Restaurants. The link is in the show notes. And now, time for the show. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great week. Hey, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
How's it going today?
So good.
So I love your products. I wanted to have you on the show for a while and talk about them. I'm really excited as a chef. I think you make some awesome stuff that, makes my life a little easier.
Well, thanks. We also admire the food that you're putting out too. So.
Well, thank you. I like to keep it interesting and using vinegar and miso in my products as much as I can.
Yeah.
So I usually start the show by kind of going into your backstory a little bit about you. Are you people who've been in food forever? Did you grow up cooking? And how did that kind of bring you to where you are today?
Well, so we spent a long time working for chefs, restaurants, and pretty much ever since we've known each other, about 10 years now, we've been really into working with organizations that are pretty hard committed to local agriculture. And, you'll know as well as I do that often means that you're pulling a lot of your processes in-house because, you want to use fresh tomatoes in August, beautiful organic heirlooms, but you've also got to master making jam and canning food and pickling things if you want to use all that stuff in January. Or if you want to have, if you want to serve pasta and you've got a local flour or grain guy, you're just making it yourself. So we've really spent a long time sort of pulling a lot of those processes in-house for different restaurants and different chefs. And one thing that it just never really made sense to do in a restaurant space, basically just for the math of how much money you have to yield per square foot of space, with higher rents, are long-term aged ferments. And so we felt at some point that there was an opportunity there for us to take up a lot of space somewhere that doesn't need a ton of foot traffic, get really close to the farms that we work with, a lot of the farms that we've spent time with and built relationships with over the last decade, and identify some of those processes that restaurants want, but just it doesn't make sense to do in the building.
I think also, both of us came from a pastry background, and, something about pastry that's a little different than more savory cooking is that the precision and the kind of adherence to the chemistry of cooking. Not that savory doesn't, but, it's crucial to pastry that you understand, what your leavener is doing and how bread works. And so I think that we kind of have always loved the experiment of food and how does this ingredient actually work? And I think that the ingredients that we make now are kind of these things that you might not think about very much. Like, I don't know how much time people spend thinking about vinegar and what it is, but it was something that really fascinated us, and knowing how the vinegar works, kind of translated into an actual business. Being able to spend that time concentrating on that experiment.
Where did you learn how to do this? Like, how did you start making vinegar and miso? Were you doing that in restaurants that you were at? Was it a side project?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it started at Woodberry Kitchen in Baltimore, which, has the wonderful advantage of being in this giant old industrial repurposed complex. And so there's just space to work with and incredible support for projects like that. Anything that can diversify the support for good growers. And we were also right down the street from Union Craft Brewing,
Yep.
which is incredible beer, of course, which is really good beer. And I think our first experiment with vinegar itself was just, I think we just had some kegs of beer from them we couldn't use for some reason, or they couldn't use. And it was just like a natural stepping stone.
It started out a lot about utilization. I think we definitely got that from Woodberry, really making sure that there's very little food waste, that, if you have leftover apple peels after making apple pie, can we figure out how to make pectin? All sorts of really crazy, really inspiring kind of idea brewing. And we had a lot of failures there with vinegar. One of the coolest things is Spike had a Frings acetator, which he kind of rigged. And that's like a pretty interesting piece of equipment for vinegar making, which we did not understand at all 10 years ago. And I had no idea what this guy was doing with this, wood tips and everything. But now I look at that and it's like, oh, it's that, we definitely failed, but.
It's one of my very favorite places. We're kind of sad. My wife's birthday is Valentine's Day, and every year we usually go there around Valentine's Day. And this year with, things, we didn't get to go. So I'm hoping to get back there soon.
They're still doing great food, I'll tell you that. So
with the vinegars, where did you start? Do you remember your first batch that you made?
We actually were working for a while, and we kept having someone bring us pineapple scraps from another place, and we just said, what are we going to do with these pineapple scraps? So we started making tepache, and that's kind of a fermented pineapple, kind of like a pineapple beer. It's like a really low alcohol drink, kind of like kombucha a little bit, because pineapple has this type of bacteria on the outside of its skin that ferments really easily. And, one batch went too far, and I ended up with a vinegar mother and had no idea what, how that happened. So I started reading about that. And, I think we just it was delicious, and we tried to replicate it. And, then I think we went to beets.
Yeah. I mean, we were buying a lot from Five Seeds Farm back then, and One Straw Farm. And we were just working with a lot of vegetables
Chicano
and produce. Chicano, yeah.
We were doing more lactic ferments. So we were making a lot of fermented vegetables. But yeah, so that I have a picture of it. And that first Vinegar Mother was, something about it's really, makes you feel really proud when you see that biofilm growing and you're just like, wow, this is what is happening here. It must be, you can tell when it's successful, and not just by taste, but visually. And it was just really exciting. And so we just kind of dove in and that immediately, I think we went straight to grain vinegars. How can we use grains to make vinegar? So we did some rice and barley, that type of thing.
Do you exclusively do Carolina Gold rice for your rice vinegar?
For the rice vinegar currently, yes, we are using just Carolina Gold rice. We use koshi-hikari from Next Step Produce for a lot of our miso and
Mung sticky rice.
Yeah, mung sticky rice, some of those. But yeah, the Carolina Gold rice has a really, delicious flavor, really buttery, and it just makes great sake and then great vinegar. So
when did you start your business, like strike out on your own?
So I want to say the very end of 2015.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll qualify that by saying that starting our business in this case means that we had a bunch of insane, we'll call it discovery. But what that means is a bunch of halfway thought out experiments in the basement of my buddy's restaurant in DC. And we sort of took that as far as we could. And even then we were selling to some restaurants in DC, Baltimore, and doing, our first stabs at, trying out farmers markets and things like that. And pretty quickly, that's when it became clear to us that space was always going to be our limiting factor. And we started to cast our eyes out towards more rural areas. And that we were having just a really chance meeting. We had sat down to talk about using the margins of the harvest with Ben Wink from Three Springs Fruit Farm, who remains our overwhelmingly predominant cider and apple supplier today. And we had just sort of finished up talking with him and ran into the owner of the farm where our business is currently located, who is Drew Peters from Sunnyside Farm. And we were just sort of chatting about the direction we were going. And she said, hey, I've got this building that I don't use on my farm. It wasn't in perfect condition, but, it just took us about a year of, taking our little days off and running up there and hanging a little bit of drywall and, trying to resurface some tile, just a lot of little dumb improvement stuff to get it up to code before we started operating out of there.
When did you start getting into other things? How long was it just vinegar? And then when did you kind of hit the transition into doing misos and then, other interesting stuff like Worcestershire?
We were always doing those things all along the way, but that's kind of the funny part of the business is that it's kind of grown as we've had success with the batches. So, it's not really easy to turn 1 gallon of apple cider vinegar into 1,000 gallons, but over, several years, that kind of can grow on its own. And then I think Worcestershire, gosh, I don't remember when we started making Worcestershire, but that is like one of the things I'm always most excited about because of just how many. We started making Worcestershire at Woodberry, but there's just so many ingredients in that are sourced from so many cool places. And it just has it has soy sauce in it. It has fermented oysters in it. It has citrus coming from New Jersey. It has spice bush berries that we forage ourselves. It has persimmons, American persimmons that we foraged, just all these really cool ingredients that comes together. And
we never set out to be a vinegar company.
Yeah.
What we did was we identified the fact that we wanted to support the entire landscape of local agriculture. So we knew that we were going to be doing fermented foods because, if we want to eat it, if it's something that a farmer grows because we want to eat, bacteria are out there that want to eat it as well. There's, we're all competing for calories.
Yeah.
So, if we said to ourselves, we want to buy grains, we want to buy fruits, vegetables, roots, we want to support good apiaries and by honey. We want to support, we'd love to see more people growing sorghum and using sorghum molasses. We just basically started looking for all the sugar in the entire world. Well, Chesapeake watershed,
this really. World, our world.
Our world, I guess. And fermentation was the way to buy all of it.
I think, and especially for two people, just the two of us, we can produce quite a bit. Vegetable fermentation is a delicious and tempting, and there's some companies that are doing some amazing things. But the two of us, when we started trying to make even, kimchi times 100 pounds, that's a lot of, I guess, work, I'll call it. But like that type of vegetable processing is quite a lot. And that time that the kimchi is good is a shorter time period. So you kind of have to make so much in a short period of time to get it out. And for vinegar, it's never going to go bad.
Yeah, we had Rachel from Sweet Farm Kraut on the podcast this summer, and they stopped doing it. And that was part of our conversation, was just the labor going into it. They were making, 8 kinds of fermented things. And now there's so much availability of craft ferments in the grocery store. Like when they started doing it, they weren't that common, but now you go to Wegmans and there's like 8 companies that have them in there. And, to be competitive in the market, it just didn't seem to be making sense for them.
I think that a couple of people that are really successful are Number One Sons in DC and Hex Ferments in Baltimore. And I think that they've really got a lot of the key fundamentals of positioning their business correctly. I mean, they're situated right there where they work. They have access to really good farmers markets, and retail outlets. And they're just like, even though it's a fermented food, that's a little bit more of a fresh product,
right.
Requires refrigeration after it's made to keep it, not to keep it from going bad, but just to keep it in a stable spot, once you've got it fermented where you want to. Whereas we don't have a refrigerator at all in our entire facility. Anything we buy that's like a fresh product, like we might get, 1,000 pounds of grapes or some apples or fruit. We just get it and plan to process it right away. And then it's into the tank for sort of vinous fermentation. It's slowly out of the tank into a tub for acetus fermentation, and then it's stored in an oak barrel till somebody buys it.
Is it literally just the two of you?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, but that was by design. That was why. So when Isaiah said we didn't really choose to do vinegar fermentation necessarily, we did. We chose to do fermentation. We chose to bring all of the as many and as much as we can get in the door. That's what we're going to turn into something.
I don't want this to sound like a political statement because it's very personal, but it just seems harder and harder to employ people these days. There's a lot of conversation about, what's the right minimum wage? What are the right workers? And as much as I don't really ever want to be anybody's employee again, I really would have to feel very secure in what we do and how we're able to treat people and how we're able to support people before we have employees ourselves.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I am someone who came most recently from contract food, and I had 7 bosses and 125 employees, and I was stuck in the middle, and it was no good on either end, and I just didn't love it. And now with the personal chef business, I have none of that. And people say, well, but you got to grow and you got to scale. It's like, I'm making enough money to support my family with the help of my wife, and like, I enjoy it. I hated having employees. I hated having a million bosses. I didn't enjoy any of it. And now it's like, I just get up and cook what I want to cook, within reason. I have customers, but on my own terms. And if I want to take Valentine's Day off because it's my wife's birthday, I do. And if someone seems like they're not going to be a great customer, I don't have to cook for them. I love that.
Growing and scaling as business principles of their own are really tough for us because, a lot of what we do is based on working really closely with the sources that we have. And, there's just a certain point where you've got to stop tailoring your process and your business to what's out there and what the greatest crop is and what tastes the best. And you have to start meeting contracted needs, or you have to pack things in a pallet a certain way, or you have to make things fit a system, and you have to go back and start talking to your growers and asking them to change what they do to fit your model. And that, when we feel like we need to do that, that's the point where we decide that the business is as big as it's ever going to be.
So how much of creating new products is it you have an idea versus you find a product? Like, do you sit and think, oh, I want to make an orange vinegar? Or is it like, I have a guy who's, it's not local, but like growing oranges and I want to use them? Like, what's dictating your new items?
I liken it very much to having a good recipe for a cake. You have a great cake recipe and you use it all the time. And today, and I think this is something that we started kind of doing at Woodberry, where there's like a base cake, and today I'm going to put figs in it. Tomorrow I'm going to put, whatever else walks in the door, the back door of the kitchen. And that's what the dessert is. And so, especially with the miso, it's more that we have kind of standards and we know how this works in this recipe and this works in this recipe. And so if right now, we had someone approach us about using chestnuts, and someday, hopefully American chestnuts, if they ever come back. But so he brought us some chestnuts, and we're considering if we can source more chestnuts next year. I actually have found a couple of farms in Pennsylvania that do have chestnuts available. And so does it work? Then we kind of plug it into the recipe that we know is how we make that type of miso. And then can we source more of it? So it's kind of like sometimes which came first, the chicken or the egg? It's mostly ingredient driven. All of a sudden there's going to be something in front of you that's an excess or, kind of untapped. And so we're going to try to make sure that we use it.
Does that mean some of this stuff is limited run? Like you've done a batch and then we might not see it again. So don't fall in love with something, because that might be the only time.
Occasionally we try really hard not to do that too often, but there have been a few things like that. We did a wineberry vinegar because we ended up with this like bounty of wineberries. It was a good vinegar. We're probably not going to do it again unless somebody walks in with, 200 pounds of wineberries that they have in their fridge that are not being sold, like that sort of thing occasionally. Yeah.
The limited run thing that's also a product we made just because the stars aligned is our bitter lemon harissa paste.
Yeah.
Which is pretty left field for us. We don't do a lot of spicy stuff. We've never really been eager to get into hot sauce making. There's just so much good hot sauce out there. But, there's this really interesting little fruit we call the bitter lemon, and it has a million names. Some people call it the flying dragon lemon. I've heard it called the hardy orange.
So trifoliate orange is the real name.
No one can really agree what to call it. And they grow really, really well around here. And there's a good reason that you don't see them in the grocery store just as lemons for people to buy. Have you had them before?
I've never had them. I have your bitter lemon vinegar.
Right on.
The lemons themselves are not good.
They're very challenging. Mechanically, there are a lot of pith, a lot of seeds, not a ton of juicy fruit. They're kind of small and hard.
Oily.
The outside has, to me, this really kind of yeasty, funny, like almost, I hate to say this, but kind of a PVC aroma. And the inside can be a little piney and green and verdant. Just whatever your imagination of a lemon before it was sort of refined and bred to be a cultivar for actual agricultural production. Like you're probably pretty close to what this is. And we just had a lucky accident early on, fermenting a bunch of those with a bunch of raw apple cider and realizing that the long fermentation really allowed some of those more offensive flavors to really just float away, like actually dissipate, maybe with the carbon dioxide production or something, who knows? And so we've been making the bitter lemon vinegar forever. And, we just had all of the fruit that we pressed back out of the vinegar, still had a lot of beautiful, I would say like the oily flavors that remain in the fruit and the skin itself. And we said, well, we better make preserved lemons out of this just to see what happens. And they're great. They're super delicious, although still a very strong flavor. And I think at some point we just picked up jar of somebody's preserved lemon harissa, never having really wrapped our heads previously around the fact that harissa, like pesto or like marinara or any sauce that's found kind of spread out across a region, has a lot of little individual variants based on what town it comes from or what local tradition it's founded in. And we're just like, man, we've got beautiful peppers around us. We've got an incredible oil grown by Susquehanna Mills, or I should say pressed by Susquehanna Mills from their sunflowers that they grow. That's organic. It's right here in Pennsylvania. We can ferment a bunch of peppers. We can put it all together, with a little bit of seasoning, a little garlic, a little salt, and make this incredible flavor. And it's been a huge hit. And we never would have made it if all of those things if all of those little stars hadn't aligned.
But that's another batch that's kind of limited because it's sort of however many lemons we get that year is how much bitter lemon vinegar we make. Then we take those lemons out and you only have so much. And so that's kind of determines, we can't just get more.
And I'll absolutely say the lemons are not fit to make into preserved lemons until they've gone through that initial fermentation with the vinegar.
Right.
Interesting. Yeah, it sounds delicious. I remember seeing when you had posted something about what kind of peppers do you use in the harissa?
Man, we've worked with Green Meadow Farm in up here close to Lancaster in Pennsylvania for some of our peppers. But I think the most recent batch that we've done was we worked with Casey and Stacy, who ran the
farm at Sunnyside.
The farm at Sunnyside, which is an incredible place down in Virginia for a long time. They've just left there to start their own farm. And particularly Casey, the has a passion for growing peppers. So I think last year we had him grow jalapenos until they were red, some Fresno peppers, a good amount of sweet peppers, like we used some Carmen de Toros, I think even some red bells, because you need to moderate the amount of heat. It can't be just pure blazing peppers, and a few more in the mix. Oh yeah, we definitely had some ají dulces in there for that floral flavor.
Yeah.
And maybe a handful of habaneros, I think, were in there as well.
Wow. So talk to me about using miso. I think most of our listeners probably have a good idea about using vinegar, and I do want to talk about that a little bit. But I think miso is one of those things that people maybe aren't used to using. Up until a handful of years ago, you couldn't even really get it in a regular grocery store. And now maybe I can get like a white and a red at my local Wegmans. But what are some of your tips for using it?
I would say, the easiest thing to start using miso and just start getting a feel for what it is capable of is to replace any time where you would use salt, but also like a vegetable stock or a beef stock or in any recipe, like anytime you're making a broth or something like that, start getting miso into it. And then with baking, I definitely would say in just any recipe that you're doing, take out, a couple tablespoons of butter and substitute in a couple tablespoons of miso. And our miso is not so salty that your salt is really going to be affected that much. You can still add the salt as well. It's just going to create kind of a depth to whatever you're doing. So banana bread, cookies, cakes. I try to share as many recipes as possible with our Instagram followers just to kind of give examples of just how prevalent miso can be in your cooking. There isn't anything, it's not going to take over whatever it is necessarily until you hit like a high point of addition, but it will just add this depth that you aren't really able to place always, but it's
there.
I think broth is, I just want to expand on that because perhaps the first thing you think of when you think about that is like, oh, I may one day make some chicken noodle soup, or I might make, some kind of beef stew. But it's cool to think about the fact that the primary association that most people have with miso is miso soup, miso broth, whether the broth is for just a bowl of miso soup or in ramen. But we could take we can apply the concept of broth to a million dishes. because everything needs a little bit of water.
Yeah, that's
right?
kind of what it is.
If, for example, I mean, we could take a page out of the ramen playbook and start with a single really flavorful stock and then turn around and make double soup out of it. So you could take a chicken stock and then you can make it a miso chicken stock. Or you could take any recipe that requires you to open up, a box of, low sodium vegetable broth or something from the grocery store and make your own miso soup from that instead. If you're making a risotto, or if you're making a relative of risotto with any other grains, like a farotto.
I use it in grits. So like if I'm doing shrimp and grits, I'll put a little in my stock and mix it in and then, see what the flavor is there. And then I'll adjust the seasonings on the shrimp and every other component to kind of complement that.
Yes, exactly. Or, your stuffing for your turkey, if you're going to pour broth over the bread to kind of bring it together, stir some miso into that and you're going to end up with a lot more.
Right. Any recipe that drinks water, really.
Yeah.
I really liked your Sea Island red pea miso, and I used that in a lot of cool things. I actually did a buttercream with it. I think it was inspired by a Eric Bruner Yang recipe. So I made a banana bread and then use the miso in the buttercream, and it went so amazingly well with the banana bread.
Yeah, absolutely. I tend more toward the sweet end of the cooking spectrum. So miso caramelizes really nicely when you're baking in the oven. So again, like I made a Muddy Buddy Chex Mix, which had peanut butter miso stirred into the melted chocolate, and that worked really well. And then the salty Chex Mix also had miso stirred into the butter that melted, and that kind of ended up caramelizing even more in the oven. So it just, there isn't anything that I would say that miso isn't appropriate to add into.
I do a caramelized miso butter where you put it dry in a pan and get it to where it's like smoking, and then just throw in some rice wine vinegar and some mirin to deglaze that out. And once it's smooth, just start throwing in a couple knobs of cold butter. And it's really nice to just toss vegetables in.
Yeah,
and I'm sure it mounts really well because miso has, it does have a little bit of emulsifying power left from the grain that it's made with.
How long are these things good? Is there any perishability issues? Like once you buy a miso and you open up a jar and stick it in the fridge, are there any ways to keep it good longer, or is that not even an issue? Does it turn or go bad or become unsafe at any point?
Unsafe, never. I suppose it's possible with enough fluctuations in temperature, especially as you use up more and more of the jar and there's just more air and space left in there. I suppose it is possible for any miso that hasn't been pasteurized or treated with ethyl alcohol to stop further fermentation, and things that we don't do. Can take on a little bit more acidity as it ages. Mm-hmm. There certainly are some bacteria, again, super safe, same type of bacteria that are in your kimchi or your kombucha that can absolutely tolerate high levels of salt. But I definitely have some containers of misos that we first made that are still in the fridge as we speak.
The reality is, like, if you can't use a jar of miso in that amount of time, none of them are really that big to begin with. So I guess just encourage everyone to use miso as much as they can. I'm
clearly biased, but I think that it's like, once you start using miso, it's almost like when you don't have it in something, you sort of miss it. It's sort of bland.
What about vinegar storage? Is that an issue? Should it be stored in the fridge once it's open? Does the vinegar continue to turn or change or anything? And does that have shelf life?
Well, I'll tell you, again, just before we even talk about the safety or the expiration of the vinegar, our buddy Michael Harlan Turkle, who wrote a book, Acid Trip, all about vinegar, some recipes, some traditions, some a little bit of sort of how it's made in areas all over the world, from Central Europe to Japan to a bunch of places in the States. Just says keep all your vinegar in the fridge, because if it's something that's really good, then it's something that was put in the bottle at exactly the right time, and it was put in the bottle in the state that it was supposed to be consumed in, and it will absolutely turn. We think there are really cool vinegars that we make just as a curiosity, a lot of ingredients that are really red, purple beets, aronia berries, after a few years in a bottle and on a shelf, they just lose their color a little bit. They lose their flavor a little bit. They're just not as sharp and vivid as they were. So yeah, we're all about refrigerating your vinegar, especially once it's opened. And of course it can, possibly continue to ferment and form new mothers. Well, form the new biofilm where the surface of the vinegar, where it meets the air. That is the sign of a healthy living vinegar. But sometimes it's kind of, you just don't want to deal with that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, safety isn't ever an issue with vinegar. It's more of a quality. Then there's other times where, well, doesn't vinegar age for a really long time? And, our vinegar does spend quite a bit of time in barrels, most of them about a year. However, that barrel is kind of a specific environment that we've kind of take care of it in that environment. And so once we put it in a bottle, yeah, you could put that in your cupboard and keep it for a year for sure. And it would be absolutely fine, but it's not quite the same as aging it in a barrel. When it's in a barrel, that barrel has kind of some permeability. So it's continuing to sort of breathe. And so, I mean, it's a selective environment, basically, is a lot of what you're dealing with fermentation. Is it fine? Yeah. Is it going to be as good? Maybe.
Well, I think people get really weirded out by like expiration dates and how old things are. Like people,
Yeah.
and I know for me personally, like I'll go on a buying spree. Like I'll go in a shop and see your stuff and buy like 8 bottles of vinegar. And then, it's like 3 years later and you're like, wow, I still have some of that, whatever, celery vinegar in my pantry or fridge or something. I don't worry about that, but people are always, I think, so scared about, because we put expiration dates on everything and you look at it, it's like, I don't know, does miso go bad,
I'll never get tired of getting up on my soapbox and talking about expiration dates. An expiration date on a label is much less of an FDA compliance or required item. And it's much more about protecting the company that makes the food. Basically, by saying, if we put our expiration date on this, we're guaranteeing sometimes that it's going to be safe up to this date, usually safe much later than that date. But they're also saying, we don't want you to open this 5 years from now and it's broken down and it's cruddy, and you think that that's the kind of food that we make. It's frequently a lot more about protecting the perceived image of quality of the food than it is the safety.
I read an article in Lucky Peach magazine. It's probably been close to 10 years ago, and Harold McGee wrote it. And he had talked about that any deviation in flavor or quality, positive or negative, means that it's past the expiration. Like if he was talking about aging food in cans, I think it was their apocalypse issue. And basically the idea is like, you could have this stuff in a can and some things taste better than when they went into the can due to aging. But if it changes, even for the positive, like whatever the date is where that product would change, that's technically what most companies said is the expiration date. And they tried doing things like putting them in slow cookers or rice cookers to kind of approximate like, okay, now we've taken Spam and we've aged it the equivalent of 10 years. Let's see how it tastes. And it was just really interesting.
From a world that we share, the restaurant industry, it's like, you don't want to put out, if you've got to knock out 100 of your garden salads or your steak entree or whatever that night, like you don't want one of them to be extra fantastic relative to the other ones.
Yeah.
Because if somebody gets it and they come back the next day and they get it and it's different, like you're creating the wrong idea, right? What you're really looking for is consistency.
Before we started rolling here, you briefly mentioned vinegar pie. I'd love to talk about vinegar pie for a minute because that's something that is delicious, but you don't see it all that often. Nobody's really making it, and I think everyone should try making it. What do you have like a favorite vinegar that you would use in that? And tell us a little bit about what vinegar pie is.
So vinegar pie is basically a pie that has a custard or a pudding that's made similar to a curd. And there's a couple different ways that you can do it. You can cook the inside filling and then pour it in the crust and let it set. You can make the filling and then pour it in the crust and bake it in the oven. The crust can be, your regular pie crust. You could do a pressed graham crust, that sort of thing. That's the basic idea. And it was Isaiah, I forget what you always call it.
I like to call it sort of a pie from the desperation pantry. There's a whole family of pies like buttermilk pie,
Chess pie.
Chess pie. Yeah, shoe fly, I think would be one of our personal favorites, and vinegar pie. And they all...
I just found a new recipe called like a funny pie, Pennsylvania funny pie, which I was really interested in trying. That's another one.
And they use a combination of dry goods, pantry goods, things that stay, good in your, in your storage for a long time, as well as maybe some fresh ingredients that you might have immediate local access to. Like they all have eggs in them.
I really like that stuff. They're interesting. We made a grape nut pie a couple of years ago, which is really interesting. And it's essentially a pecan pie, but take out the really expensive pecans and put like the world's cheapest cereal in there. And it was really good.
That's like the oat pies are a similar thing too, where you're just kind of subbing out. No one has pecans, if you're even now.
And I'll be honest, we definitely, I would say our palates are really geared to look for citrus and other familiar flavors in pies like that. And I think the first time you ever take a bite of a vinegar pie, you might have to recalibrate, but it doesn't take, you take a bite or two and you sort of, okay, I get this. My brain's reset my expectations. One of my favorite things in the Noma fermentation book is not actually a recipe or a technique, but just their insistence that you taste as much with this organ as this one. Your brain as your tongue. And basically once you get over that hump, it's super delicious. I think my personal favorite vinegar to do it with is probably the sorghum molasses.
Yeah, vinegar. I would say sorghum molasses too, actually.
Ooh, something that sounds good.
Sorghum kind of gives a caramelly flavor that works really well. We've done it with the bitter lemon and with the ginger. The ginger is really good too, bright, acidic, tends toward more citrusy, but the sorghum, something about caramel and bitter and sour works really well.
Just a super quick intro to what sorghum molasses is, maybe that explains why it has that caramel flavor. Sorghum grows and it's a super tall cane. It's really, it looks a lot like sugar cane, from a distance. And the cane itself, you press, you run it through a press and juice comes out, and the juice is already, usually about 20% sugar. Really, again, very similar to sugar cane. It's a bright green. It's got this kind of awesome grassy flavor, but for some reason that is outside the depth of my knowledge, it doesn't crystallize when reduced in the same way that sugar cane does. So the method of taking that fresh product and preserving it is the same thing as that you would do actually with like maple sap.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know anything about that. I mean, I've had sorghum molasses before with, I just thought it was very similar to like regular molasses, but hearing that it comes out as like green and kind of piney, like I wouldn't see that at all.
Right. And so you've got to cook it down until I think probably a good standard would be about 80 until it's about 85% sugar. And so you're cooking and cooking and cooking and reducing it. And the closer you get to the end of that, the higher your temperatures are, and the more you're turning that beautiful green grassy flavor into a really complicated, lightly smoky, lightly savory caramel. Mm-hmm. And there's just no way there's just a natural flavor development from how you're preserving this fresh product.
So you make your own sorghum molasses?
We definitely don't. We got this in Virginia that we get all of our sorghum from. And we have done some vinegar with fresh green sorghum juice.
Yeah. But it's the flavor for better, whereas the green sorghum vinegar was very delicious, but a little bit of a hard sell because it's just so unique that you really don't know what you're getting into. And frankly, if you've ever tasted maple sap juice, water, they sell it now, I believe. It doesn't have, it's like the essence of maple syrup, but like not.
It's a little more subtle.
Yeah, it's just not quite there. So the green sorghum juice is kind of the same thing. it's this really interesting flavor and it's really good, but it doesn't quite.
There's also that it's really difficult to try to find a supplier of that fresh
Yeah.
juice, just because they've got to grow it, they've got to process it, or they've got to get an enormous truck to deliver you a bunch of sorghum stalks, which, then you have to process. And in order to do that kind of processing on farm, you're getting into like juice HACCP plans and all other sorts of weird regulation that farmers are just not, at the scale of farm that we like to deal with best, they're just not equipped to really take that on for a single sort of product that doesn't, hold biodiversity.
So what are some of your goals for this year?
Well, I think I've probably pounded it out several times that what we really need is square footage. And right now we are just bursting at the seams in our current facility. And we are just trying to line up all the factors to sort of stay out here in central Pennsylvania. We love to be connected to the farmers that we're working with. We love to be close to them. We love to keep working out sort of the natural rhythms of when we, they're delivering to these, going from Adams County to Philadelphia, and we're on the way and we work it out, and just all sorts of efficiencies. And we live in Harrisburg, and we think it's one of the coolest cities on the planet. We live about a block from the Susquehanna River, which is gorgeous. It's always different. It's unbelievably beautiful. And, just like, you might have said about Pittsburgh 20 years ago, there's just a ton of prime, beautiful industrial space. And we'd love to get into some of it. The question is just sort of finding the right space, doesn't have asbestos or, it doesn't need $2 million worth of rehab. Otherwise, there are literally buildings, caved in with forests growing inside of them, a mile or two from here. So we're just looking for exactly the right one. And that's going to be huge for us. I think that we'd like to sort of keep the breadth of offerings that we have growing as slowly as possible. It's a terrible business plan to make 40 different kinds of vinegar and a dozen different kinds of miso and soy sauce and white soy sauce and harissa paste and Worcestershire sauce and other condiments based in vinegar and miso.
Yeah.
But, hopefully be able to expand access to those offerings just by getting them out. If we, the more efficient we can get, the more we can figure out how to make this product work and turn it into something that people use in an everyday way rather than just as a sort of a specialty item.
Who are some of your favorite people in your field? So like, who's some awesome people doing stuff with fermentation, vinegars, misos? Do you have people you're big fans of?
I would say for people that are using our stuff really creatively or using fermented foods really creatively, I think that Cadence in Philadelphia is doing a fantastic job. They go through a lot of our product and often have to deal with us saying, oh, we're sort of out of this Viognier white wine vinegar, but we're moving into this Petit Manseng white vinegar. And I think that they do a really good job sort of adjusting what they do. They've got a brilliant menu set up for it, kind of like a 4-course setup and a few options in each course. And so they're really able to keep a lot of flexibility in what they do. I would say a lot of the restaurants that we work with that are doing what we do really well have a menu that's set up like that to do it really well. I was really impressed.
River Twice in Philadelphia is another one.
That guy's amazing.
He's just doing, he's doing a ton of his own fermentation as well. There's quite a few in Philadelphia that are really inspiring. Ari Miller, he's doing hummus and cheesesteaks and just kind of this, quick delivery type of food as a lot of restaurants are doing right now. But it's just beautiful looking and like really hearty. And he always talks about like a relationship cuisine where he's really working so hard to create relationships with every ingredient that he makes or uses, which obviously speaks to us. I think Johnny Spiro in DC, he's always one that I appreciate him so much for his flexibility. He'll place an order and I'll be like, well, I have a couple of quarts of this strange walnut oil that comes off the black walnut miso. Do you want to try it? And he'll try it and use it. And I always think that that's a really interesting, inspirational he uses the ingredients.
That's probably my favorite restaurant in DC. I love what he's doing.
We connected with Tail Up Goat in DC.
Yeah.
They're, I think that they're really committed to finding the things that they like and then going wholeheartedly into that. And after we had worked together for a little bit, they use us as their vinegar exclusively. And we've eaten a few times there since. And I think that it really drives a little bit how they think about their flavor. Not, any one particular dish or there's no like vinegar. What did Charlie Trotter used to always do? Like study of vinegar flavors, study of foods. But, there's, there might be a little bit of preserved, like slightly dried tomatoes that they've got holding on for the summer that they rehydrate in a little bit of vinegar. And they've just really incorporated it as a staple sort of tool or ingredient in their arsenal. And I think it really, their food is obviously super good. And I think it's affected a lot by that.
This makes me miss going out to eat at restaurants.
No. That's why it's hard to answer this question, because there's just so... Anytime I see a dish where I recognize one of our ingredients in it, it's always different. Everyone has their own take on how they're doing it. It's just always such a thrill to see it on a plate and see how someone used it. Ariel Welch is the pastry chef for Ardent. Justin Carlisle.
Oh yeah.
His pastry chef, Ariel Welch, uses the miso in many of her desserts that she's doing. They did a stroopwafel. They did this cake, this farro miso cake with parsnips, which I'm not a fan of parsnips at all. And I immediately wanted to eat this cake. Like, just really like beautiful.
That's somewhere I want to go. I've never been to Milwaukee before, so it's definitely on my list of places.
Yeah.
Well, do you have anything else you want to talk about? I think this has been a great conversation. What did we not go over? Anything? I mean, I'm sure we could talk about ferments for hours, but anything else you want to talk about?
Just to answer your last question a little bit more, if we're talking about other people who are creating fermented food that we're really inspired by, there are certainly a lot of people doing what we're doing. And I think we always feel like we were, really early on, but I think that probably has to do with the fact that we were early on and very small in 2015, after working on sort of unwrapping the mystery of some of these ferments for a few years before that. And we're just sort of slowly growing. And I think maybe a lot of people that we're just coming into contact with now, or just who are intruding on our awareness now, maybe have been on the same trajectory and have been interested in this stuff for a long time. And I guess what we see that's really heartening is that there are a lot of small little vinegar producers. You can probably, with a little bit of research, find one in most major cities in the United States. And as long as they're really farm driven, I think that's really big for us. Like I said, we certainly don't want to be the specialty vinegar that can be all things to all people. And one of those things that we don't want to do is be, the vinegar that you've just got to have if you're in, even if you're in England or, South Africa or California. Even I don't want to say no to anybody that wants to buy any vinegar from us, but I just think that there's really good fermentable sugar all over the world, and I love to see it used. If anything, we don't want to displace those other creators. We'd like to continue to displace
Heinz.
The big companies.
We'd like to displace vinegar that's created as an industrial byproduct of cellulose fermentation from sawdust. We'd like to replace vinegar that's just like thickened and sweetened with extra sugar for no reason and with some sort of like flavor sprayed into it.
The companies that are coming up doing fermentation, I hope are finding these slots in this kind of agricultural cycle that there's waste. So is it a company that's sitting right next to a brewery and the brewery's throwing away a ton of their beer and they're kind of taking up that beer and turning it into malt vinegar? That's great. It would be even better if that beer company is using local grains to make their beer, ideally. But there are more of these companies, and that's what we like. That's the inspiration, is that this ingredient comes from something that may be overlooked.
Yeah, kind of closing the circle there with production.
Yes, exactly.
And I think as chefs are more interested in themselves, not only using local products and, responsible sourcing, they're also really interested in finding ways to not waste products. So it's kind of come full circle. It's not just in the kitchen side, but also the production side, which I think is really cool.
I remember when we first started the business, I was pulling a lot of shifts at the Dabney in DC, just sort of helping them out with their AM crew a few days a week. And people coming in and just being shocked, be like, at the cost of some of the ingredients that would come into that restaurant. And they were like, oh my God, you guys are spending as much on your vegetables, per pound or per serving or whatever, as many restaurants are spending on the center of the plate, the meat or what it is. And there's just when you're supporting the right growers and the right farms, there's a lack of industrialization that's going to make things a little more costly. And frankly, to be a little bit of a downer, there's a lack of sort of labor exploitation that's also going to keep prices high. And you've just got to build your cuisine around that. And a lot of that does include using, the leaves and the roots and the different parts of it and getting flavor out of all the pieces of the crop.
Well, and cost is always a conversation. I mean, your vinegar is obviously more expensive than a very commercial vinegar on the shelves. I think people are starting to get used to paying more for quality products, I hope, and seeing a more diverse selection out in the market in general. But it is, whether it's buying heritage breed animals or vegetables from a small farmer, I think that's been one of the big barriers forever, is people just are so used to buying a 99-cent hamburger at McDonald's and buying, a 2-pound bag of carrots for $1. And we have some work to do to get people used to paying for better products.
And wanting to.
Yeah. And supporting local communities and small producers.
And on the restaurant end too, walking in and seeing the price of something and saying, that's right.
The price of food from a consumer standpoint is just such a tough conversation for me, because I think we're so used to looking at, if you want to go out and you want to buy a new car and you're looking for a very, common new car would be like, you want kind of a mid-sized crossover. You can look at a Subaru Forester and a Toyota RAV4 and the offering from all the different manufacturers, and you can do some price comparisons. And there's some levels of standardization about, units of how it performs this way or that way or the other. And so we take this mindset and we say, well, I'm going to shop at local supermarket X instead of Y because this is 30 cents cheaper a pound. Or, when I go through the checkout aisle, I'm always a little more shocked at the price when I go to this place. And we're just so removed from what could possibly be causing those disparities in pricing that our sort of natural shopping instinct is just not suited to the task for figuring out what things really should cost. And the effort to actually do some background or to stay fully educated on, all of the packaging options and what does organic mean and free range and all the verbiage that can be used. It's just more than I think you can reasonably expect most people to care enough about.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thanks so much for coming on the show. I really appreciated having you, and I look forward to continuing to use your products in new and interesting ways.
I'm super excited. I think that once this is all over, we're going to get together and use them together. And
I hope we do.
And we'll do some cooking.
Yeah.
I'd love that.
Thank you for having us. We really appreciate it. We've been following you for a while too, and nice to talk.
Well, I want to bring producers into the mix too. It's Chefs Without Restaurants, but I just love the idea of people doing their own thing in the food world that just isn't related to being like a line cook or an executive chef somewhere. So,
I think that we all, a lot of us, well, maybe people my age and maybe a little younger, have grown up in this sort of unprecedented era in modern times of the glorification of what it means to be a chef. And there's, of course, a million TV shows that weren't there a long time ago. And as much as I loved throughout my 20s, going to work from 8 a.m. to midnight and going back to work from 8 a.m. to midnight the next day, working a double down brunch weekend, you know what I mean? And doing all that, it's a great lifestyle for a while. But there are so many ways to make restaurants better that don't necessarily involve being in a restaurant. And I think it's a really awesome path for people, especially after they've sort of, so to speak, made their bones or built up a lot of skill and a lot of familiarity, to go out and bolster with these, what can make people's dining experiences better and what can make restaurants a stronger part of a healthy food system by being in the industry's peripheral to them.
And I love restaurants. Like, I'm not anti-restaurant. I just don't like working in restaurants. Like, I love restaurants. I don't want restaurants to die. I've never worked in a restaurant. Like, I say this all the time. I've started in a kitchen in 1992 when I was a teenager, but it wasn't a restaurant. I've exclusively done catering and contract food, and I worked for IKEA, and I've been a catering manager at a hospital. Like, I just didn't like that working till 2 a.m. and the restaurant grind and necessarily working a line. Like, I just wasn't driven to that. And I've started to find a lot of people had similar stories, or they started doing it and weren't really interested in continuing it. And I thought, let's build like a community and share the stories of like-minded individuals.
Yeah. And if we're being like super honest about that, we started to get a little older, and you take a look at your life and your habits and your health and everything. And we decided that maybe we wanted to amplify people's ability to create flavor and really good flavor experiences without necessarily having to kick up salt, fat, sugar, all the things that we know how to do in the restaurant industry that, to make the food so rich and so good. It's something that people can't or wouldn't necessarily cook at home. And I thought, I really would want to be the kind of chef who's feeding people like fermented foods and really healthy stuff, but it still really has this incredible flavor package. And really, like, it's not good enough. You know what I mean? There are some people that are just natural born chefs and unbelievable with flavor and cooking and especially line cooking and all that. And I think that I just one day realized that, like, I'm really, I feel a lot more confident working out a system, a factory, a food manufacturing system, if you will, to give these people the tools to do it.
Yeah, not everyone's meant to be a line cook or an executive chef. I mean, we need good food producers who are making awesome quality products. So thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Yeah. If there's anything I can ever do, let me know. And I'll be posting all your info in the show notes so people will know where to find you and pick up some products to stock their own pantries. Well, thanks again for coming on the show. I really enjoyed having you. And to all of our listeners, this has been Chris with the Chefs Without Restaurants podcast. As always, you can find us at chefswithoutrestaurants.com.org and on all social media. Thanks so much and have a great day. Thanks for listening to the Chefs Without Restaurants podcast. And if you're interested in being a guest on the show or sponsoring a show, please let us know. We can be reached at chefswithoutrestaurants@gmail.com. Thanks so much.